in the forgotten hollows of eastern Kentucky. Where the fog clings to the mountains like a burial shroud, and the trees whisper secrets older than memory, there existed a family whose name was spoken only in hushed tones. The Pritchards, a bloodline so tangled within itself that it had become something less than human, something nature itself seemed determined to erase. This is not a tale of ghosts or curses, but something far more terrifying, the systematic destruction of a family through their own choices, generation after generation, each child born carrying the sins of those who came before. The year was 1968, and deep in the mountains of Harlan County, where roads turned to mud paths and civilization felt like a distant dream, lived Marcus Pritchard. He was 43 years old, though his weathered face and hunched posture made him appear decades older. Constantly, his hands trembled, a hereditary condition that had plagued the Pritchard men for as long as anyone could remember. But Marcus's tremors were different. Worse. They came with blinding headaches that would drop him to his knees, with episodes where he forgot his own name, with a rage that erupted without warning. Marcus lived in a cabin that his grandfather had built with timber from these same mountains, a structure that sagged under the weight of too many years and too many secrets. The paint had long since peeled away, revealing gray wood beneath that looked almost skeletal in the early morning light. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of kerosene lamps and something else, something medicinal and sour, that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. His wife was Sarah, but Sarah was not just his wife. She was his first cousin, the daughter of his father's brother. Their marriage had raised eyebrows even in these isolated hills, where such unions were not unheard of. But the Pritchards had always kept to themselves, had always believed that their blood was special, that mixing it with outsiders would dilute something precious. What they didn't understand, what they refused to see, was that their blood had become poison. Sarah moved through the cabin like a ghost, her thin frame draped in a faded house dress that hung loose on her shoulders. At 38, she had already lost most of her teeth, a common affliction in these parts, but accelerated in her case by the genetic weakness that ran through her bones. Her eyes, once bright blue, had taken on a milky quality, and she walked with a limp that grew more pronounced with each passing year. The doctors in town, the few times she had been brought to them, whispered about degenerative conditions, about chromosomal abnormalities, about things that happened when family trees didn't branch. They had 6 children. Each one carried the mark of their tangled heritage in different ways. The eldest was Thomas, 22 years old, who had been born with a cleft palate so severe that his speech was barely intelligible. He had the mind of a child, they said, though whether that was from birth or from the beatings Marcus delivered in his rages, no one could say for certain. Thomas spent his days rocking on the porch, making sounds that might have been songs, his fingers twisting in patterns only he understood. Then came Rebecca, 19, who had been beautiful once, or so the neighbors claimed. But Rebecca had inherited her father's tremors and her mother's deteriorating eyesight, and by the time she was 15, she could barely see well enough to navigate the cabin's 3 rooms. She had been promised to her second cousin, Daniel Pritchard, in a union that would further concentrate the damaged bloodline. But Daniel had fled to Lexington before the wedding, one of the few Pritchards smart enough to escape. The middle children were twins, James and Jennifer, 17 years old, and inseparable in a way that made people uncomfortable. They had been born prematurely, weighing barely 3 pounds each, and had spent the first months of their lives fighting to survive. They had made it, but at a cost. James had lungs that wheezed with every breath, a condition the mountain people called consumption. though it was something more insidious, more genetic. Jennifer was deaf in one ear and partially blind in one eye. Her face was asymmetrical, in a way that spoke of developmental problems in the womb. The youngest two were Peter, 13, and little Anne, just 8 years old. Peter had seizures, violent convulsions that would strike without warning and leave him unconscious on the cabin floor. Foam gathering at the corners of his mouth, and the baby seemed almost normal at first glance. But she hadn't spoken a word since her 4th birthday, and her vacant stare suggested that something fundamental had failed to develop properly in her mind. This was the Pritchard family in the autumn of 1968. A collection of damaged souls living in isolation, their bodies and minds paying the price for generations of consanguinity. Marcus didn't work much anymore. His tremors made it impossible to hold the mining job he'd once had, and the small disability check from the state barely kept them fed. Instead, he spent his days drinking moonshine that his cousin made in a still deeper in the mountains, the alcohol temporarily quieting the storms in his head. When the drink wore off, the storms returned with greater fury. On a cold October evening, as the sun disappeared behind the mountains and shadows filled the hollow like dark water, Marcus sat at the rough wooden table that dominated their main room. Sarah was cooking beans and cornbread on the wood stove, the only meal they could afford most days. The children were scattered around the cabin, Thomas rocking, Rebecca sitting motionless in the corner, the twins huddled together whispering, Peter lying on a pallet watching the ceiling, and Anne playing with a corn husk doll that had no face. Marcus's hands shook as he lifted the mason jar to his lips, the clear liquid inside sloshing with the movement. He drank deeply, grimacing at the burn, then slammed the jar down hard enough to crack the wood beneath it. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "Your brother came by today." Sarah's back stiffened, but she didn't turn from the stove. What did Raymond want? Wanted to talk about Jennifer. Says his boy William is of marrying age now. The wooden spoon in Sarah's hand stopped moving. In the corner, Jennifer's head snapped up, her good eye wide with something that might have been fear or might have been resignation. "William is her first cousin," Sarah said quietly. Marcus laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "And what are you to me, woman? What am I to you? We're cousins and we're fine, ain't we? Strong enough, smart enough. Raymond says the boy's healthy. Says he'll take good care of her." "Marcus, please." Sarah's voice broke on the words. "Look at our children. Look at what we've done." The sound of Marcus's chair scraping back echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. He was across the room in 3 strides, his hand gripping Sarah's thin arm hard enough to leave bruises. "What we've done! What we've done!" "There ain't nothing wrong with our blood. You hear me? My daddy married his cousin and his daddy before him, and we're all fine. The Pritchards are special. We keep our blood pure." Pure. Sarah's voice rose to a shriek, something breaking inside her after years of silent acceptance. "Thomas can't speak proper. Rebecca's going blind. Peter has fits that might kill him any day. And Anne, sweet little Anne, she don't even know we're here half the time." "How is that pure, Marcus? How is that special?" The slap came fast, snapping Sarah's head to the side. Blood appeared at the corner of her mouth, and she stumbled back against the stove. The children didn't move, didn't make a sound. They had seen this before too many times to count. Marcus stood over his wife, breathing hard, his whole body shaking now. "Jennifer will marry William, and that's final. Raymond's coming by Sunday to make the arrangements. And maybe, just maybe, their children will be worth something, unlike this worthless lot." He gestured broadly at his children, his face twisted with disgust, and something else, something that might have been shame if he'd been capable of such insight. Then he grabbed his coat from the peg by the door and stormed out into the night, leaving his family in stunned silence. Rebecca was the first to move, crossing the room to help her mother. Jennifer remained frozen, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had gone white. The twins huddled closer, and Thomas's rocking accelerated, his wordless sounds taking on a distressed quality. Confessional, because the stories we tell here are the ones no one else dares to speak, the forbidden truths hidden in bloodlines that society would rather forget. Subscribe now and bear witness to the darkest chapters of human history. Sarah wiped the blood from her mouth with the back of her hand and straightened slowly. Every movement pained. She looked at her daughter, really looked at her, seeing not just the physical deterioration, but the resignation in Jennifer's eyes, the acceptance that her fate was sealed. "No," Sarah said so quietly that at first no one was sure they'd heard her. Rebecca turned to her mother. "Mama!" "No," Sarah repeated louder this time. "Not again. Not Jennifer. Not any of them." Chapter 2 begins on a Sunday morning, 3 days after Marcus's declaration. The sky was heavy with clouds that promised rain, and the air smelled of damp earth and decay. Raymond Pritchard arrived just after dawn, driving a battered pickup truck that rattled and wheezed its way up the rutted path to Marcus's cabin. He was Marcus's second cousin, a man of similar age, but in marginally better condition, though his left eye wandered independently of his right. A trait that ran through the Pritchard bloodline, like a cruel signature. With Raymond came his son, William, a boy of 20 who looked both younger and older than his years. He was small, stunted, really, with a pronounced limp from legs that had grown unequal lengths. His teeth protruded slightly, giving his face a rodent-like quality, and his hands were too large for his thin arms. But his eyes were alert, intelligent even, and they fixed on Jennifer with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Marcus greeted them on the porch, his mood improved by 3 days of steady drinking. He shook Raymond's hand with his trembling grip and clapped William on the shoulder. "Come in. Come in. Sarah's got coffee on, and we can discuss the particulars." Inside, Sarah stood by the stove, her face carefully blank. The children had been instructed to make themselves scarce. All except Jennifer, who sat at the table, looking at her hands. Her twin brother, James, hovered near the door, unwilling to leave her alone despite his father's orders. The men sat down, and Sarah poured coffee into chipped mugs, her hands steady despite the turmoil inside her. Raymond pulled out a folded paper from his jacket pocket and smoothed it on the table. "I had the preacher draw up the marriage contract," he said. "Nothing fancy, but it's legal enough for these parts. William here. He's a hard worker, and he'll treat Jennifer right. They can live with us until they're ready to build their own place, and any children they have will be Pritchards through and through." Marcus nodded approvingly, but before he could speak, Sarah's voice cut through the room. "And what kind of children do you think they'll have, Raymond?" The room fell silent, Raymond's wandering eye fixed on Sarah, while his good eye looked somewhere past her shoulder. "Good children. Pritchard children. Like Thomas." Sarah gestured toward the porch where her eldest son rocked. "Like Rebecca, who can barely see. Like Peter, who falls down in fits. Like Anne, who don't speak." Raymond's face darkened. "No, Sarah. That ain't got nothing to do with it." "It has everything to do with it." Sarah's voice rose, years of suppressed horror finally breaking free. "We've been marrying each other for so long that we've forgotten what healthy children look like." My grandmother married her uncle, Raymond, her uncle-y, and her children were sickly, and their children were sicker. And now look at us. Look at what we've become. Marcus stood up so fast his chair toppled backward. Woman, you shut your mouth right now. But Sarah didn't stop. She couldn't stop. I went to the library in town last month, Marcus. I read books. There's a word for what we've been doing. Consanguinity. And there's science that explains what happens when relatives have children together. The same bad things get concentrated, doubled up until there ain't nothing good left. Our children are suffering because of what we did, and Jennifer's children will suffer even worse if we let this happen. William spoke for the first time, his voice surprisingly deep. I ain't afraid of having children with Jennifer. The Pritchard blood is strong. Strong. Sarah laughed, a sound on the edge of hysteria. Boy, you limp when you walk. Your eyes don't focus together, and I'd bet money you get headaches so bad you can't see straight. That ain't strong. That's broken. We're all broken. And we keep breaking our children because we're too proud or too stupid to stop. Marcus moved towards Sarah with murder in his eyes, but James stepped between them, his wheezing breath loud in the sudden silence. The 17-year-old boy was thin and weak, but he stood his ground, facing his father. She's right, Pa, James said quietly. We all know she's right. Look at us, really look. There ain't a one of us that's whole. For a long moment, Marcus stared at his son, his hands clenching and unclenching. Then he shoved James aside hard enough to send the boy sprawling, his weak lungs gasping for air. Get out, Marcus said to Raymond and William. Get out and don't come back until this ungrateful witch remembers her place. Raymond gathered up his papers slowly, his expression unreadable. William's eyes lingered on Jennifer for a moment, and something in his gaze made her shudder. Then they were gone, the truck's engine roaring to life and fading into the distance. Marcus turned to Sarah, his whole body vibrating with rage. You've shamed me in front of my family. You've shamed the Pritchard name. There ain't no shame worse than what we've done to our children. Sarah whispered. What happened next would become legend in the hollow, spoken of in whispers for decades to come. Marcus raised his hand to strike Sarah, but before the blow could land, Thomas appeared in the doorway. The eldest son, the one with the mind of a child, the one who could barely speak, moved with sudden purpose. He grabbed his father's arm with surprising strength, his incomprehensible sounds taking on a tone that was unmistakably protective. Marcus tried to shake him off, but Thomas held firm. Then Rebecca was there, and James, struggling to his feet. Even Peter, barely recovered from his last seizure, stood blocking his father's path to their mother. Only Anne remained apart, playing with her faceless doll, oblivious to the confrontation. Marcus looked at his children, really looked at them for the first time in years, and something in his expression crumbled. He saw Thomas's twisted mouth, Rebecca's clouded eyes, James's sunken chest, Peter's scarred tongue from biting through it during fits, and the vacancy in all their faces. He saw what his pride and his family's obsession with pure blood had created. Without a word, Marcus turned and walked out of the cabin. He headed up the mountain path toward the place where his grandfather was buried, where his father was buried, where generations of Pritchards lay beneath simple stone markers. He walked until his trembling legs could carry him no further, and then he sat down on his father's grave and wept. Back in the cabin, Sarah gathered her children around her. We're leaving, she said. I don't know where we're going or how we're going to survive, but we ain't staying here. And Jennifer, you listen to me. You ain't marrying William or any other Pritchard. You hear me?" Jennifer nodded, tears streaming down her asymmetrical face. For the first time in her life, she felt something that might have been hope. The autumn rain began to fall, cold and steady, washing the mountains clean. In the Pritchard cabin, a family made plans to escape their own history. But the question remained, was it already too late? Had the damage been done so thoroughly, so completely that no amount of running could save them from the rot in their blood? Chapter 3 opened 6 months later in the spring of 1969. Sarah had kept her word, though the escape had been neither clean nor complete. With the help of a social worker from Lexington, who had heard rumors about the isolated families in these mountains, she had managed to move the children to a small rental house on the outskirts of Harlantown. It wasn't much. Just 4 rooms with indoor plumbing and electricity that worked most of the time. But to children who had grown up by kerosene lamp, it was a miracle. Marcus had not followed them. After that night of reckoning, he had retreated deeper into the mountains, living in an abandoned hunting cabin supplied by relatives who still believed in the old ways. Some said he had gone completely mad, that his tremors had gotten so bad he could barely feed himself, that the headaches had progressed into something worse. Others claimed they'd seen him wandering the ridges at night, calling out names of Pritchards long dead. The social worker, a young woman named Elena Morrison, had taken a particular interest in the family. She had arranged for the children to see doctors, real doctors with modern equipment and medical degrees. What they found confirmed Sarah's worst fears, and exceeded them in ways she hadn't imagined. Thomas, at 22, had the cognitive development of a 7-year-old. The cleft palate that had never been properly repaired had caused chronic infections that damaged his brain development. But more than that, genetic testing revealed something the doctors called recessive genetic disorders. Conditions that only appeared when the same damaged gene came from both parents. Conditions that guaranteed his children, if he ever had any, would be even more severely affected. Rebecca's vision problems were progressive and irreversible. A hereditary condition made catastrophic by the concentration of faulty genes. She would be completely blind within 5 years. The doctors said the same genetic analysis showed markers for early onset dementia, a horrifying revelation that meant her mind would fail even faster than her eyes. The twins, James and Jennifer, shared similar genetic markers. James's lung condition was a hereditary weakness that would likely kill him before 40. Jennifer's hearing loss was progressive, and she carried genetic markers for bone disease that would eventually leave her crippled. The asymmetry of her face was mild compared to what future generations might experience if she reproduced with another Pritchard. Peter's seizures were a manifestation of a neurological disorder that ran through the entire bloodline, lying dormant in some, destructive in others. The doctors put him on medication that helped but couldn't cure the underlying genetic damage. And Anne, sweet silent Anne, she was perhaps the most heartbreaking case. The specialists determined she had a form of developmental disability caused by the doubling of recessive genes, a condition that stole her ability to process language and left her trapped in a fog of incomprehension. She would never speak, never fully understand the world around her, never live independently. Elena sat with Sarah in the small kitchen of the rental house on a warm April afternoon. The test results spread across the table between them. Outside, the children played in a small yard, their laughter carrying through the open window, bittersweet in its simple joy. "I need you to understand something, Sarah," Elena said gently. "What happened to your children? What's happening to families throughout these mountains? It's not your fault. You didn't know. Your parents didn't know. This has been going on for so long that it became normal, but it was never right. Sarah stared at the papers covered in medical terminology she couldn't fully understand. But I did know. In my heart. Every time I looked at my babies and saw something wrong, I knew. I just didn't want to admit it. There are other families. Elena continued. Other bloodlines that have done this same thing, kept themselves isolated, married cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces. There's a family over in Lee County, the Combs family, where 3 generations of first cousin marriages produced children who couldn't walk, couldn't talk, couldn't live past their teenage years. There's the Fugate family, famous for their blue skin, a genetic condition so rare it should never appear, except that they married each other over and over until the gene became common. These mountains are full of bloodlines that have poisoned themselves with pride. What can we do? Sarah asked. How do we fix this? Elena chose her words carefully. You can't fix what's already done, Sarah. Your children will carry these conditions for the rest of their lives. But you can make sure it stops with them. That means no more marriages within the family. That means educating them about genetics, about why outsiders aren't threats but salvation. That means breaking the cycle. Jennifer appeared in the doorway, drawn by the serious tone of the conversation. At 19, she was old enough to understand what was being discussed, old enough to feel the weight of her family's history, pressing down on her future. What if I want children someday? Jennifer asked quietly. Normal children. With a man who ain't related to me. Is that even possible? Elena turned to face the girl, her expression compassionate but honest. Jennifer, the truth is complicated. If you marry someone completely unrelated to you, someone with no Pritchard blood, your children would have a much better chance. They'd only get 1 copy of the damaged genes instead of 2. But there's still risk. Some of these conditions could still appear, just less severely. You'd need genetic counseling, careful medical supervision throughout pregnancy, and honest conversations with any potential partner about what they'd be taking on. Jennifer sat down at the table, her hands folded in her lap. William still writes me letters. His daddy brings them to town, leaves them at the general store. He says he don't care about what the doctors say, that he loves me, that we could still have a good life together. Sarah's face went pale. You ain't been writing him back, have you? No, Mama. I throw the letters away without reading most of them. But sometimes I wonder if anybody else would want me, knowing what I carry in my blood. You're 19 years old, Elena said firmly. You have time to heal, to grow, to find out who you are beyond this hollow and this family. The world is bigger than these mountains, Jennifer. There are men out there who would see you for who you are, not just what bloodline you come from. Through the window, they could see Thomas playing with Anne, his childlike mind connecting with her silent world. In a way the others couldn't. He was making shapes with his twisted hands. And she was watching, actually watching, her vacant eyes holding a flicker of something like understanding. I want to say something, Jennifer said suddenly. Something that I need people to understand, if they ever hear our story. She paused, gathering her courage. We ain't monsters, and we ain't freaks. We're just people who got dealt a bad hand by the choices of people who came before us. And if our story can stop even one family from making the same mistakes, then maybe all this suffering means something. Leave a comment right now saying exactly what Jennifer just said. We ain't monsters and we ain't freaks. We're just people who got dealt a bad hand by the choices of people who came before us. Let her words be heard. Let this story matter. Elena reached across the table and squeezed Jennifer's hand. That's exactly why I'm documenting all of this, so that people understand, so that it never happens again. But even as she spoke, they all knew the truth. In the hollows and hidden valleys of these mountains, other families were still making the same choices, still believing their blood was special, still producing children who would suffer for sins they didn't commit. Chapter 4 unfolds 2 years later in the summer of 1971. The Pritchard family had found a fragile stability in their new life, though the weight of their past pressed on them constantly. Thomas worked at a sheltered workshop in town, simple assembly tasks that his limited cognition could handle. Rebecca, her vision now almost completely gone, had learned to navigate their small house by touch and memory, and she'd taken up weaving baskets, her skilled fingers creating beauty even as her eyes failed her. The twins had found different paths. James worked at the library, his weak lungs limiting physical labor, but his mind sharp and hungry for knowledge. Jennifer had enrolled in a community program, teaching basic nursing skills, determined to help others even as she carried her own burden of genetic damage. Peter's seizures remained a constant threat, but medication had reduced their frequency. And Anne, now 10 years old, attended a special school where teachers trained in developmental disabilities worked patiently with her silent world. But the past was not content to stay buried. On a humid July evening, as cicadas sang their shrill chorus and heat lightning flickered on the horizon, a truck pulled up outside their house. Raymond Pritchard emerged, older and more bent than 2 years before, his wandering eye more pronounced. With him came William, now 22, his limp more severe, his protruding teeth more prominent, his large hands shaking with a tremor that had begun manifesting in the past year. Sarah saw them through the window, and her blood ran cold. Jennifer, go to your room. Rebecca, Thomas, take Anne and Peter upstairs. Now. The children obeyed the urgency in her voice, disappearing quickly. Only James remained, standing beside his mother as she opened the door. Sarah, Raymond said, his voice carrying a note of desperation that hadn't been there before. We need to talk. It's important. It's about William. I got nothing to say to you, Raymond, and William's got no business here. Please. Raymond's face crumpled and suddenly he looked ancient, defeated. My boy is dying, Sarah. The doctors in Lexington, they say his kidneys are failing. Some kind of hereditary condition, they call it. They say he needs a transplant, but his blood type is rare, and his tissue markers are so specific that the only matches would be close family. Sarah's expression didn't soften. And what's that got to do with us? William spoke then, his deep voice now weak and thready. They tested everyone in our immediate family. Nobody's a match close enough. But the doctors said that, because our families have intermarried so much, Jennifer might be compatible. She's close enough genetically that she could potentially be a donor. The request hung in the air like poison. Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides. You want Jennifer to give you a kidney? After everything? After you wanted to marry her and trap her in the same cycle that's killing you now, after your family has spent generations creating these exact problems? I know, William said, and tears ran down his face. I know what we did was wrong. I know that now. But I don't want to die, Mrs. Pritchard. I'm 22 years old, and the doctors say I got maybe 6 months without a transplant. Please, just ask her. Let her decide. James stepped forward, his wheezing breath audible. You need to leave now. But Jennifer's voice came from the stairs. I'll do it. Everyone turned. Jennifer stood there, her asymmetrical face set with determination, her partially blind eye staring somewhere past William's shoulder, her good eye clear and certain. "Jennifer, no," Sarah said immediately. "You don't owe him anything. You don't owe any of them anything." "I know I don't owe him nothing, Mama. But if I can save a life, ain't that what matters? Ain't that what breaks the cycle? Showing mercy when we could show hate." Alina Morrison had educated Jennifer well. She understood that donating a kidney carried risks, especially for someone with her genetic background. She understood that living with one kidney meant vulnerability if that kidney ever failed. She understood that William represented everything wrong with her family's history. But she also understood something else, that the rot in their blood, the damage done by generations of consanguinity, didn't have to define who they were as people. That she could choose to be more than her genetics, more than her family's mistakes. "I'll get tested," Jennifer said. "If I'm a match, I'll do it. But William, you got to promise me something." William nodded eagerly, desperately. "Anything. You got to promise that you'll never marry a Pritchard or any other relative. That if you survive this, you'll leave these mountains and build a life somewhere else. That you'll break the cycle like we're trying to do. Can you promise me that?" William looked at his father, then back at Jennifer. "I promise. I swear it." The testing took 3 weeks. Jennifer was indeed a compatible match, close enough that the transplant had a good chance of success. The surgery was scheduled for September at the University Hospital in Lexington, and Alina helped arrange the expenses through various charitable programs. The night before the surgery, Sarah sat with Jennifer in their small bedroom, braiding her daughter's hair like she had when Jennifer was little. "You're braver than I ever was," Sarah said quietly. "Stronger. I'm scared, Mama. Scared of the surgery, scared it won't work, scared that I'm making a mistake. Then why do it?" Jennifer was quiet for a long moment. "Because somebody has to be the one who chooses different. Somebody has to be the one who shows that we ain't just our blood. We ain't just our family's sins. Maybe saving William's life don't fix nothing that came before, but maybe it starts something new, something better." The surgery took 9 hours. Jennifer survived it, though the recovery was harder than anyone anticipated. Her remaining kidney struggled initially, stressed by the genetic weaknesses in her system, but it stabilized, and she healed slowly, but steadily. William's body accepted the kidney. His failing health reversed, color returning to his skin, strength to his limbs. He kept his promise, moving to Louisville 6 months later, finding work in a factory, eventually meeting a woman with no connection to the mountains, or the twisted bloodlines within them. But the story of the Pritchards didn't end with one act of mercy. Chapter 5 brings us to the autumn of 1973, 4 years after Sarah had taken her children and fled the Hollow. Marcus Pritchard had not been seen in town for over a year, and rumors circulated that he had finally succumbed to the tremors and headaches that had plagued him. Some claimed to have seen his body being carried down from the mountains by distant relatives. Others said he still wandered the ridges, a ghost among his ancestors' graves. The truth, as Alina Morrison discovered while researching other consanguineous families in the region, was somehow worse. Marcus had indeed died, but not from his neurological conditions. He had walked into the woods one winter morning and never come back. They found him 3 days later, frozen beneath a hickory tree, his trembling finally stilled. But before he died, he had written something, carved into the bark of that tree with a knife, words that the relatives who found him tried to hide, but couldn't completely erase. "I poisoned my own blood. God forgive me. When Sarah heard the news, she didn't cry. She had no tears left for Marcus, for the man who had helped create their children's suffering and refused to acknowledge it until too late. But she did take the children, all of them, back to the hollow one final time. They stood in front of the old cabin, now abandoned and sagging even more severely, nature reclaiming what the Pritchards had built. The family cemetery was just up the hill, generations of Pritchards buried beneath stone markers that bore the same last names over and over. Pritchard married to Pritchard, cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, the family tree not branching but circling back on itself in an impossible tangle. "I want you all to see this," Sarah said to her children. "I want you to understand where you came from. Not so you can be ashamed, but so you can choose different. Every person buried here thought they were doing right by keeping the family together, keeping the blood pure. They didn't know about genetics or science, but we know, and knowing means we got to do better." Thomas, now 26 but still with the mind of a child, placed wildflowers on his father's fresh grave. Rebecca, completely blind now, stood with her hand on Jennifer's shoulder. James wheezed quietly, his weak lungs struggling with the mountain air. Peter, seizure, free for 6 months, thanks to new medication, held Anne's hand, the silent 12-year-old staring at the graves with her empty eyes. Jennifer spoke, her voice carrying across the hollow. "We're the last generation of Pritchards that will suffer like this. We're breaking the cycle. Our children, if we have them, will be different, better, healthier, because we're choosing love over pride, science over tradition, and the future over the past." Elena stood apart, documenting everything, knowing this story needed to be told. She had found 17 other families in these mountains with similar histories, bloodlines so tangled that genetic diseases had become commonplace, accepted, normalized. The Pritchards were not unique. They were simply the ones willing to admit the truth. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the hollow, the family turned away from their past and walked toward the car that would take them back to town, back to their new life. They left behind the cabin, the graves, the ghosts of choices made in ignorance and pride. But Jennifer stopped at the edge of the cemetery and looked back one final time. She thought of William, alive because she chose mercy. She thought of her siblings, damaged but surviving, choosing different paths. She thought of all the children, yet to be born, who would never know this particular suffering because their generation had the courage to break free. "What ain't monsters?" she whispered to the wind. "We're just people who got dealt a bad hand, but we're still here, and we're still fighting, and that's got to count for something." The father who carried rot in his blood, the Appalachian lineage that never stopped dying. This was their story. A tale of genetic destruction wrought by generations of consanguinity, of families who confused isolation with strength and paid the price in their children's broken bodies and minds. But it was also a story of survival, of the courage to face uncomfortable truths and choose a different path forward. Yes, if you watched until here, it means this story touched something deep within you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know you and recognize those who truly appreciate the stories on this channel. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because these are the stories that need to be told. The hidden truths that society tries to forget. Give this video a thumbs up if it opened your eyes to the dark consequences of consanguinity and the strength it takes to break generational cycles. And share this with someone who needs to understand that our choices today shape the lives of generations yet to come. The Pritchard story is over, but its lessons must live on.